Welcome to the Superstar Communicator podcast. My name is Susan Heaton-Wright, a leading impact, speaking and communications expert. My aim is to show you how to make an impact so you will be heard, listened to and respected for career success. Listen weekly to the podcast and go to our website, superstarcommunicator.com. Hello everybody, this is Susan Heaton-Wright. I am delighted you're here on the call today, and I am so pleased that so many of you are engaging with the podcast, both downloading it, but also getting in contact with me about the content, saying that it's of value to you and that it's helping you during this time. I am really pleased because on the other end of the internet today, I have got a lady who got in contact with me because she had listened to my podcast and it resonated with her. Beth Hartley started her career as a management consultant at Deloitte, having graduated from Cambridge University. She now leads a team in commercial strategy in Sainsbury's head office and was recently appointed as chair of Enable, the first ever Sainsbury's disability network. She has a lifetime of experience living and working with a hearing loss and is dedicated to helping people with disabilities and differences excel. She focuses on raising awareness, increasing confidence, and simplifying workplace processes to better support people with disabilities. As part of her work, Beth has presented her experience to employers across the UK at number 10 Downing Street, the DWP and the Houses of Parliament. Beth is a disability advocate and recently featured on the BBC London News underlying the challenges of COVID-19 face mask guidelines on those with a hearing loss and raising awareness of ways to communicate effectively. So, welcome, Beth. I'm so pleased to have you.
Thank you so much, Susan. It's an absolute honour to be here today, and I'm just really delighted to be joining you.
You have focused on something that is very relevant with the BBC London News, the fact that we are using masks and it's more difficult for you to be able to hear what we're saying.
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, raising awareness, particularly in the current environment with the COVID-19 guidelines making face masks mandatory in a lot of places now, has been one of my kind of priorities. And just explaining to people and really building that awareness of the challenges that people that lip read can face because of that. I think what's really interesting to me is that actually when you or I talk to people and we say, oh, do you know anyone who has a hearing loss or a disability? They say, oh, no, I can't think of anyone that has one. And then actually you ask them, oh, so do you have any elderly relatives, or do you have people in your team who, for maybe English isn't their first language? How about when you went to that Italian coffee shop the other day? And they're like, oh yeah, actually you're right. My grandmother finds it quite hard to hear in the restaurant, and it just looks like she's switching off a bit. Or I've got to be really clear when I'm talking to someone who's for English isn't their first language. I've got to, enunciate really clearly. And actually, when we delve down into it, most of us know someone who relies on lip reading or has some form of a hearing loss, and where we kind of almost subconsciously adapt to communicate with them. I think the latest statistics from Action on Hearing Loss say that 1 in 6 in the UK has some form of hearing loss. thought 1 in 6, that's 12 million people. And that goes up to 70% of people over the age of 70. So most people over 70 will struggle with hearing in some form. And that's where we can really, that's why raising awareness is so key. It affects far more of us than one might first imagine.
That's really, really interesting statistic, isn't it? We hear about musicians, and, you know, I come from a performing background where musicians, particularly rock musicians or sound engineers, lose some of their hearing. I remember working on an event with a sound engineer who had partly lost part of his hearing in particular pitches, and he kept altering things so the balance wasn't right because he couldn't actually hear very well.
Wow, exactly. And that just, I think, illustrates that many of us will actually experience some deterioration in our hearing as we get older. And we won't necessarily say, oh, I've got a disability, or even say that you have a hearing loss. It's just there, and we adapt to it, and the people around us adapt to it. But at the end of the day, I think what I've learned from my professional services background, with working with clients across the globe, and also within Sainsbury's now, and having my hearing loss, is that communication, this isn't about just disability, this is about communicating effectively. And if you can do that, everybody wins, and everyone has the best possible chance to excel, because at the end of the day, who doesn't want to be heard?
Do you think that there is an element of people thinking that hearing loss is attached to old age?
I think there probably is, and it's not entirely untrue. So I can certainly say that it tends to be older people that I know who have a hearing loss. And one really interesting thing that I came across recently was, so I have a hearing loss. I've had a hearing loss since birth, as has my older brother.
Oh, right.
But we have no history of hearing impairment within my family. And so when my parents realised that my brother was deaf, they thought that my mum had eaten some sort of poisonous berries in the garden, which seems very odd now, but I think at the time there were, you know, medical write-ups about this being a possibility, and you've got to be a bit careful. But it just, I think, highlights the shock for them.
Yes.
But most parents that have a child with a disability won't necessarily have met anyone before that who had a disability. So, you know, hearing loss is, I think, to that point, a very new thing to people. And that's why what I'm doing is really explaining how people can help, and you know, just bringing those things to light. And often it will be things that we're already doing already. There'll be, you know, elements of best practice that people might have come across in, you know, all of those effective communication sessions at work and training. But I think my role is that, from my experience, is to really bring it to light that these little things, these simple things, can make the biggest difference.
Now, I have been reading your some of your posts, and you told me actually quite a horrifying story of when you were at school and you wanted to move forward so you could hear better. And it broke my heart. Do you mind sharing it?
Yeah, no, of course. So I think when I was about 5, so I was in reception. I think many of your listeners will probably relate. I was in a kids, you know, a classroom, and it was a reading time. You know, so on a sort of Friday afternoon, we'd have reading time, and the teacher would sit down in the chair, and all the kids would come and sit on the floor in front of them in a sort of circle, and listen to the book that was being read. And we were called over to the carpet, and another girl got there first and sat directly in front of the teacher. But in my mind, I was like, well, I need to sit there. So I not really knowing how to explain the need that, you know, I have a hearing loss, and really, would you mind just moving slightly to the left so that I can sit face on to lip read? I just sat on top of her. And I'm quite a big girl. I'm still quite a big girl. I'm nearly 6 foot. But I don't think she or the teacher or her parents took that very lightly. But it just illustrates for me that you can't really expect a 5-year-old to be able to explain eloquently the needs that they have, and so will find ways to compensate. Thankfully, I don't sit on top of people when that sort of thing happens now. But it just illustrates that all of us are going to have trouble communicating at some point, right? You know, if it's a loud coffee shop or a restaurant, or
I find now.
Exactly, a nightclub, a bar, and so it can be hard to explain what we need.
Did you find that the school, in school, did you find that you were well supported?
Generally, I've been really well supported. So I've been state schooled all the way up until I was 18 and went off to university. And of course, there are particular teachers that have really stood out in my memory as being very inclusive. And they tended to be the ones that would ask me what I needed, and ask my parents what would help, who had maybe had my brother already in an earlier year, so they'd become more aware of that. But I think there isn't, I remember very vividly and quite fondly, you want to fit in, don't you? And that's the trouble, is that no one wants to talk and call themselves out as being different or having a different need that could be, I don't know, inconvenient. And once, when I was in sixth form, so this is when I'm much older now, I went into my geography class, and all my friends sat in the back row, and well, I wanted to be with my friends, so I also sat in the back row. And the teacher, who had been my teacher for a number of years by that point, obviously recognised that I didn't want to be singled out, and he asked the entire back row to stand up and the entire front row to stand up, and he said, can everyone on these 2 rows switch over? So he moved the whole row forward, and that included me and all of my friends, so I was still part of my group, but sat at the front where I could actually hear him. And it's just, it illustrates for me that sometimes if people are aware, they can just give you that helping hand when confidence is lacking. So we can really help each other.
Oh, brilliant. Now, you know, everybody will look at what you're doing. You went to Cambridge University, you worked as a management consultant for Deloitte, and now you have a very responsible job at Sainsbury's. And they might say, well, you know, surely it was easy for you.
I have actually had that question to me before when I've been doing my campaigning, which is, Beth, that's great that, you know, you've got this far and you're leading a team and you went to Cambridge, and actually most people aren't like that, so you're not really relevant. And, you know, most people won't achieve that. But actually, the reason I'm here is because I have experience through my career, and also having had a hearing loss, of the strategies that work, of, you know, the way that you can be creative and adaptable to work through things. And that's how I want to help other people is to take the hard work out, and to simplify things and to help them simplify things. Really the things that have helped me succeed can actually be broken down. And that's what I'm doing as part of my work now, is really making those things visible so that other people can excel in the way that they want to.
Oh, well said. I know that you pulled a face for the listeners when I asked that question. Beth, that I don't believe that, but I was asking that question in case any of the listeners were going to ask, we're going to think that, because it's almost like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. I know this is a very poor analogy, but Ginger Rogers would always say, well, I'm dancing in heels going backwards. So I've got some extra things that I need to think about in order to achieve greatness.
I love that. I think you're completely right there. But often people say, Beth, working with your, having got to where you've got to and achieved all the things that you have, you got into Cambridge, you got onto the graduate scheme at Deloitte, it must take a tremendous amount of resilience, right? Resilience, that's what it is.
Oh, that's the good old buzzword.
And I find that so frustrating. I don't know about you, but my again, for me, it's about breaking down what do you actually mean by resilience? What have I actually done to make those things happen? And quite a bit of it will be about problem solving. It's about having a very, very good support network around me of particularly my parents who repeat things for me. When I go to the shops now, I've got my fiance who they ask me in Simmons whether I want bread in my roll. I look at him and he supports me in those really difficult times. So okay, right, we're talking about problem solving, someone else supporting you or delegating in a difficult situation. And actually there are things that we can all work on and get better at. It's not that I'm kind of completely inaccessible. These are all learnings that are very applicable to everyone.
So this moves me very swiftly to 3 top tips. Now, I am particularly interested in 3 ways that we, the listeners, could help people like yourself who have what I call an invisible disability. Because me and my listeners, I speak on behalf of them, we want to be able to support people.
Absolutely. I actually asked my father last night what tips he would have, because of course he's got 2 kids who have hearing loss, so good to hear it from someone who, if you'll pardon the pun, someone who has been very close to that for many years. I think my first one, probably the singular most important thing that you can do, is look at the person or look at your audience when you're talking. Get their attention before you start speaking, and look at them ideally face on so that they can see your eyes and lips. Now, even with face masks, I will read your eyes. So your eyes will betray a lot about your expression, your meaning. And so looking at me still makes a difference. And of course, the sound is then projecting itself towards me. I think it's important as well to make sure that you're in a good place that's fairly well lit, and just remember that light can cast shadows, so that can make it harder to lip read. So I think you can't always get around those things, but typically if I go into a restaurant with someone, I'll choose the table that has the best lighting where I can see their face, because over the course of, a 2 or 3 hour meal, that's actually quite exhausting. Yes. So that's certainly something to bear in mind. I think in the workplace, the worst offenders, I suppose, in the actual workplace, the physical workplace, people pacing when they're doing presentations. Okay, so they walk one way down the stage and then they turn around and then they walk the other way, and not only are you generating background noise because of your footsteps, but you're also then maybe not even at all looking at the audience face on. So I would always recommend that you stand still, preferably by the speaker behind the podium, and actually face on, and your stillness will bring people's attention not to your walking up and down the stage, but to your actual messages, which I think is ultimately what everyone wants. And if you've got a presentation behind you, a lot of people would turn, look at the presentation and talk to the presentation and not the audience as they're sort of looking at the graph or whatever. So you get quite a bit of talking into whiteboards or talking into presentations. So again, that's something that I would say to watch out for, is that to try and stay facing the audience when you're talking, or if you do need to look behind you and then return back and talk. On virtual it's a bit different, but again, it's just be aware of darting eyes and actually not looking at the screen, and if you are going to make a contribution to a meeting and you don't want to be on video the whole time, come on just for the bit where you're saying something and then go off video again, because that again helps people to read your meaning and understand you better. That I think is the first thing. I know it's a bit of spiel, but I think it's really important. We all hear tips about communicating virtually and being better, and there's so many things, but just to bring it to life a little bit, the second thing is the way you speak. So you're very good at this, Susan, but I mean, you really are just a perfect example of best practice, and that's part of the reason I absolutely love listening to your podcast, because they're so relaxing. But I think the main things are you pause when you speak, so you don't rush. So I think pausing is really important, and enunciating clearly. But related to that is something that I picked up when I did some media training recently with the guy who used to be kind of the head of PR for Tony Blair. And he did this media training, which was about how to do a good radio interview. And one of the things he was saying was that it's really important that you vary your tone and lift it so that you're not speaking in a monotone and that people can really engage with what you're saying. And I think that's really important for people communicating with people with a hearing loss as well, is really to, if you're excited, bring something to it, sound excited, because that really helps us to pick up your meaning, and that for me is one of the challenges that I have with people who speak in an accent, is that it can be quite the same tone the whole way through, which is difficult to deduce where words start and stop. So that's really key. And then the third one is gestures. So I do this a lot, but simple gestures like pointing at something, or gesturing with your hands, or even writing something down, that makes a really big difference. So if I'm giving directions to someone, I'll sort of do a bit of an air hostess kind of, this to your right and left. And my fiance teases me about that all the time. But it's great though, because the reason they do that is because we're all kind of, you've got to keep our attention and focus, and it does, doesn't it? Because we all joke about it. As a reason why actors are so flamboyant is because we remember what we've seen. And so it's a very effective way of getting meaning across with 3 gestures. So if you're going back to the office and you're wearing a face mask, be aware of that. If you're in a public environment, or you're communicating with someone who's deaf, or you're doing a presentation, you will have a much bigger impact if you can gesture and bring your body into it a little bit to convey what you want to say. So it would be my sort of 3 key things, I think.
It's absolutely fascinating, sort of thinking back to the first one and the third one. The first one about not pacing around the room and things like that. And also the gestures in the third one. There are presentation skills people that tell you not to gesture. I am not one of those people. And to move around, if you go to the right, that's the past. If you go to the left, that's the future. And everyone will pick up on, it's just...
Not heard that one before. But...
And I did that without thinking. And somebody said, well, you really use that moving into the future and the past. Had no idea about it, but, I park that. Isn't it interesting how actually these things that some people can be taught, and they're using them because they've been on these courses, and I've got to hold my hands like this because it's distracting. Actually, we use our hands.
It's a very, as you say, a delicate balance, isn't it?
If I was sort of like this the whole time, then that would be distracting. But actually, we use these things to emphasize. And with going back to stagecraft, if you are thinking, I've got to move to the right now because I'm talking about the future, or whatever it is, actually, it's distracting in your brain as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think
distracting.
It's keeping things simple, isn't it?
Yes.
So if you're distracted by executing it, then it probably is.
Yes. It's got to be natural. So if I'm thinking I mustn't use my hands because I'm on screen, your brain is going to be thinking, I want to move my hands because I'm wanting to gesture.
Absolutely. It's difficult, and I received quite a bit of training on this when I started at Deloitte, because we were talking with clients and how do you have maximum impact. One thing is just to be aware of is having your hands too close to your face. So if you are using your hands, you need to keep them away from your face, because from a lip reading perspective, that is very distracting, like covering your face or having something moving around there. So I would caution people of doing that. But generally, everyone will have a different style to communication. So you should do what comes naturally to you.
Definitely.
I like using my hands, but it should be, complementary to what you're saying rather than forced. And if you are moving about, just be aware, if you're wearing heels, that it does generate a noise distraction as well as the movement distraction. So as you say, I think it's a very delicate balance, and obviously should be targeted to whatever audience you're in. You don't want to come across as a stick glued to the floor. But equally, I think some people do prefer a little bit of movement just because it helps them with nerves and things.
Yes.
I try personally not to hold anything when I'm talking, because papers rustle. Like even a pen tapping or whatever, it's like someone was telling me it's like a bit like a teddy bear. It's a comfort blanket. Even if you're just holding a pen, but it's just these things, like even the paper now that I'm touching, it makes a sound, and it's very distracting. And if you're listening back to a meeting or a virtual podcast, it's particularly distracting if you're just listening to it and there's no video. So because the sound is like amplified because you're just listening. So that's definitely worth being aware of, because I know we watch recordings and things a lot nowadays. So
very, very interesting. So I'm sure, listeners, these are some things that you can really, really think about, so that you can support people with with hearing loss to be included in the conversation. But before we go, are there any ways that we can get in contact with you, support the work that you're doing, Beth? Anything else?
Absolutely. So you can reach me via LinkedIn. I am at Elizabeth Hartley. And there I am putting up my blog posts. I've just started to write a blog, and I'm publishing those articles on LinkedIn for the moment. So you'll see a bit about my thought leadership and where that's going. Secondly, Instagram, for those of you that use it, my handle is at Elizabeth Hartley, and there I'll share pictures, but also, the latest news about what I've been working on. And very happy to answer any questions over email if you do want to reach out on LinkedIn. Something that's coming up is that I'll shortly be launching a new website, which will tell you a bit more about the services that I'll be helping people with in the future. So that'll be things like anything from kind of one-to-one coaching to article publications or keynote speeches, all of which I've been doing in the last kind of couple of years, but have yet to kind of offer anything formally. So do keep an ear out for that. Of course, the news will be on LinkedIn so that you can see where that's going. And I hope that your listeners want to kind of join me on the journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure, listeners, that you will want to support Beth because you, like me, want to make sure that we have an inclusive society. Thank you so much, Beth, for coming on today. I know that you have a very busy schedule and you've taken time out of your day to have this interview. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
So many things to think about, so many things for us to consider to move forward.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for listening today. This is Susan Heaton-Wright from Superstar Communicator. Until that next time, take care. You have been listening to the Superstar Communicator podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and review the podcast on iTunes and on apps. Please contact us if you want to discuss any topic, could suggest a topic for us to include, or a guest who could come onto the podcast. Go to superstarcommunicator.com.